Mr. Black, good to have you on with us.
Thank you.
Okay, you got the floor for the rest of the hour, and I don't want to take much more time than that because I want you to be able to complete the interview that you've been gracious enough to do with us there in your offices. But my big issue that I'd like you to speak about first is the same crew, the same ideas have built Ponzi schemes many orders larger, and instead of even getting in trouble, they're being seen as our saviors and offering even bigger Ponzi schemes as their solution. So is this leading us to rack and ruin?
It has already led us to there. But you're right, unless we remove this ideology and these folks from power, they will produce recurrent, intensifying crises.
In layman's terms, what are we currently facing? Who's guilty? How do we stop it?
Well, in layman's terms, the FBI began publicly warning in September 2004 that there was an epidemic, their word, of mortgage fraud. And they said if this epidemic is not stopped, it will produce an economic crisis at least as large as the savings and loan debacle. And then they said, but of course we've learned the lessons from the savings and loan debacle, and we'll be all over this one, so it won't cause those problems. Well, they were right about the first two things. Obviously, they weren't even close to right about the third. The FBI has said something else immensely important, and that is that 80% of the mortgage fraud is induced by the lenders. So think about that in terms of, taxpayer revolts and things like that. You shouldn't be focusing on the individual borrowers as much, at least, as you should be focusing on the big CEOs of these specialty places that, as you said, ran Ponzi schemes in order to get extraordinarily rich through their bonus compensation systems. And then, in many cases walk away, and in other cases remain there, still in control, and being subsidized by all of us as taxpayers right now.
Now, you talk about this being engineered fraud, or the term you use is this control fraud. Break that down, and then let's get specifically into the fraud we're witnessing right now.
Sure. Control fraud is simply a term for what happens when you have a seemingly legitimate organization. In other words, as opposed to an obvious mob shop type of thing, where the person who controls it uses it as a weapon to defraud others. And if the CEO is the crook, he can take care of all the internal controls, he can get rid of all the underwriting, and you don't defeat internal controls, you actually suborn them, you turn them into allies. And so these folks were able to get clean audit opinions from the most elite accounting institutions in the world, even though the places were massively insolvent. They were, of course, able to get grossly inflated appraisals from top appraisers, and they were able to get AAA, that's pristine, that's supposed to mean zero credit risk, AAA ratings from the top 3 rating companies in the world for stuff that was known in the trade as toxic waste. And that allowed them to sell trillions of dollars, well over $2 trillion in toxic waste out into the world. And of course, it's led to extraordinarily large losses.
Now, this has been described as a Ponzi scheme too big to fail, and it's now a black hole, and that the industry that engineered this understands that they can hold the population hostage and say, just do whatever we say or we'll have a depression. And then when we end up in a depression anyways from their activities, they're going to be sitting there with all the assets.
Well, I call it the suicide strategy. I don't know if people have seen Blazing Saddles, but the sheriff is surrounded by hostile town folks. He takes out his gun, points it at his own head, and says, don't move or I'll shoot. And that's essentially what these big banks are doing. They're saying, give us unlimited amounts of money or we'll fail, and if we fail, we'll take down the entire economy with you. Why we would believe any of these people is beyond me. Why we would leave in charge people that are willing to make that kind of obscene extortion is absolutely beyond me.
Now, specifically, from your experience, tell the listeners a little bit about who you've investigated in the past, what you've dealt with. I mean, you're one of the leading experts really in the world on going after these types of frauds. But the difference here is the media is not saying the Keating Five are bad or the regulators were bad that let it happen. Instead, they're saying these are our saviors. So is this new territory where they're just a blank check to do whatever they want?
Now, the terrible shame about this is this isn't simply a case of failing to learn from mistakes in the past. We've forgotten successes in the past. So during the savings and loan debacle, for example, we actually looked. God forbid, that would be a nice idea, wouldn't it? Look at what was causing the problems. We had a national commission. I was the deputy staff director on that. It concluded, after looking at all the major failures, that at the typical large failure, fraud was, their words, invariably present. And they meant fraud from the CEO ranks, right? So there we knew what was going on. We knew the pattern that these frauds followed, and it's very similar to the existing one. You gut your underwriting, you pervert your internal controls, you grow massively, and you make the worst possible loans because you can grow a lot faster by making bad loans than trying to compete for good loans, and because bad loans will pay more in the short term in terms of higher interest rates and fees. And you make a ton of money as an absolute mathematical guarantee when you do that during the expansion phase of the bubble. And then, of course, it's also guaranteed that you'll produce a catastrophe. So I was, at the staff level, the person leading the re-regulation of the savings and loan industry. As a litigation director, I was suing the crooks. And as I said, unlike this crisis, we went after places like Lincoln Savings when they were still reporting they were in the most profitable savings and loans in the country. We said, no, you're frauds, and went about trying to put them out of business. In the current crisis, the FBI did not even begin to investigate the big lenders. And remember, 80% of the fraud, according to the FBI, comes from the lenders. The FBI doesn't even begin to investigate them until March of 2007, when the entire secondary market in toxic waste shuts down. And of course, it's now 2 years later, and there is not a single significant indictment of any of these specialty frauds. And a whole chunk of these folks, what they sold was known in the trade as liar's loans. Now, how hard is it as a prosecutor or as a regulator to figure out that if the trade calls something a fraud, it's probably a fraud?
Amazing. They even label it a fraud. And well, I mean, look at Madoff. How for 9 years was he telling the SEC this was going on? And then when the SEC is asked about it, they say, oh, he's not guilty, or he hasn't pled guilty yet when he already had. And then they arrogantly, declare executive privilege.
Well, the SEC has been emasculated. It is utterly non-functional. What we now know, finally, because finally Congress started to hold some hearings last year into the rating agencies, and we learned the following things about the rating agencies. And the rating agencies were absolutely critical. If you don't get a AAA rating, you can't sell this toxic waste.
All right, stay there, sir. We got a break. Quick break. Come back with our guest, William K. Black. He is a associate professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law, and one of the head honchos that went after the SNL barons successfully during the 1980s. But now they're back with a vengeance and swallowing the whole world in a black hole of debt.